So good afternoon everyone. This presentation will solely reflect on the archival findings and the contents of the documents that we are currently digitizing at the Aurobindo Borua Library in Mahabodhi Society of India headquarters, which is situated in the Bankim Chatterjee Street, Kolkata. Along with digitizing, as sir mentioned before, cataloging the metadata and doing a field survey of what other journals are currently being hosted at the library, we are also looking at the content of the documents, mostly the Mahabodhi journals. But along with that, we have very recently started digitizing some other periodical publications such as the BOSAT, the British Buddhist, the Hawaiian Buddhist Annual, or the Mahabodhi College Magazine. In my presentation, I will simply try to trace some patterns from these contents that raise multiple research questions and interests. This is not a completed or all-inclusive research work yet, but certain extremely important historical, theosophical, and political dashes that are embedded in these rare archives of the organization. Next slide. Anagarika Dharmapala has been mentioned as the first Buddhist missionary of modern times. This modernity, or the conception of a modern age in understanding and socio-political practice, arrived in India and other South Asian countries as fractured and fragmented amidst anti-colonial movements against the empire and riots of religious sects, castes and communities. This modernity held the Western, the empire, as a standardization. It was not spontaneous at first and was heavily influenced by the colonizers. In the sociopolitics of the subcontinent, it resulted in the rise of nationalist spirit and the creation of the nation image, but simultaneously the colonial hangover took over as well. A new class was created, meddling in between the colonizers and the colonized. They were English educated, urban cultured, upper class and caste, and mostly male. For Bengal, this new Babu culture flourished majorly. They also impacted the economic market. In religious practices, modernism was not only evidenced in the institutions like Brahmo Samaj or the Theosophic Society, but also in their philosophies and principles. The Chicago World Religion Parliament happened in 1893, giving birth to the interfaith movement, and also the concept of world religioning come across, which has been defined by Tomoko Masuzawa as a discursive formation by which the religion were commensurate. Next slide. Now, such an idea of world religion can also be understood as a key alternative to the radical binary and opposition of religions in the colonies. In the context of 19th and 20th century India, amidst the Hindu-Muslim riots and the erasure of marginalized religious sects and philosophies, this can be understood as an antithesis to its contemporary. Buddhism, as it has historically developed from the Nastika tradition in the post-Vedic era, fundamentally resisted the tendencies of developing monolithic religious supremacies and has repeatedly proposed an all-inclusive model for institutionalized regions. Now, in the last decade of the 19th century, in 1891, when Dharmapala visited Sarnath to find the Buddhist temple under the Saiva priests who manipulated to claim the temple as part of the Hindutva, he understood the requirement for a home base, a centralized structure of South Asian Buddhism if it aspires to be world religion. Bodh Gaya, the place where Buddha attended enlightenment or Bodhi, had to be reclaimed by Dharmapala, and the engulfment of Buddhism by the supremacy of Hindutva had to be resisted. The Sarnath situation and the reclamation of Bodh Gaya thus did not remain a court case but became a movement, true to the term, a transition from the narrow sectarian religious practices to a transnational imagination of Buddhism. It became a struggle for survival, for gathering a substantial place in a world modernizing. Dharmapala returns to Colombo and establishes the Mahabodhi Society. The next year, in 1892, the headquarters of the organization was shifted to Kolkata, India. Mahabodhi Society became a platform and space for propagating Dharmapala's vision, and the approach to world religioning was made across space and other religions. In the first category, in my understanding from his writings and other scholarly comments, Dharmapala attempted to use the empire, the geopolitical conglomeration of the colonies and the center as a tool, as a whole, within which he and the Mahabodhi Society would be able to create a stronghold for Buddhism, institutionalize and spread the religion. Stephen Kemper commented on Dharmapala that he was a theosophic at first, not a politician, and if the journal entries of the organization are categorized into theosophic or Buddhist philosophy and the socio-political based on their content, the former most certainly would outweigh the latter. But such a separation between the theosophic and the socio-political is impossible and unreal, and thus many of Dharmapala's attempts were highly criticized, for they were politically inclined either in favor or in opposition of the empire. Moreover, this dicey standpoint of both the individual Dharmapala and the Mahabodhi Society as an organization in the context of the contemporary rise of extreme nationalist spirit also portrays him as a diplomatic who writes letters to the Westerners in sweet and respectful words, but also who voices loudly against colonization in Chicago World Parliament. On the other hand, Dharmapala kept maintaining and initiating conversations and publishing news and reports about different religious sects in the Mahabodhi journals, thus preaching an all-inclusive approach to the plurality of religions. Next slide. To understand how the sociopolitics of contemporary times and the political theology of Dharmapala and the organization intersected, here is an aggregated list of the most prominent historical events in India. In 1895, 6 years before the foundation of the Mahabodhi Society, the Indian National Congress was established. I mentioned before when and how the Mahabodhi was founded and shifted to Kolkata. That very year of 1892, the journal started to be published. The first volumes of the journal majorly include theological notes on Buddhism, managerial and organizational news, the vision and mission of the Mahabodhi Society. There are no pathways of financial aid to the society like advertisements of donations that have been mentioned in the first issue. Next, in 1893, the Chicago Parliament took place, which brought Dharmapala closer to Vivekananda, Pratap Chandra Majumdar and others, about which I will talk later on. In 1905, the decision of partition, and in response, the Swadeshi movement happened. In 1906, the Muslim League was founded. Next slide. Here is the first page of the very first issue of the journal of 1892 that has been digitized. Next slide. We have digitized journals from 1892 to 1911 with some years missing in between. We have talked with the library personnel at the Mahabodhi Society and searched ourselves as well, but those issues are not there. We have recently started digitizing other journals like the Bosat or Hawaiian Buddhist Annual, as I mentioned before. The Bosat is more in a magazine format. It contains more stories, excerpts from or translations of Buddhist texts rather than philosophical or socio-political pieces. Next slide. Coming back to the Mahabodhi journal, the content of it can be broadly categorized into 5 sections. The contents are published under subheadings and are very haphazard. In the volumes after 1905, they are somewhat more organized, yet not completely. The first category is the direct socio-political representations, which include subheadings like notes and news, personal or some independent discrete news pieces with their own subheadings. These sections contain news like how the National Congress held their recent cabinet, or how Dadabhai Nauroji expressed his defeat, and new spiritual realizations after the breaking up of the Liberal Party. The second category of intellectual communication included reviews of other Buddhist journals published worldwide from different countries and organizations, correspondences and letter exchanges like Vivekananda's letter to Pyari Mohan Mukherjee about the translation of the Mahabharata. Reports on other organizations like Annie Besant talks about the headquarters of the Theosophic Society. There is an epistemic category which may include core Buddhist Theravada philosophies, excerpts from Buddhist texts or ancient Indian Sanskritic texts, translations, Pali linguistic text, excerpts from Pali dictionary, list of words like that, etc. The fourth category is commercial communication, which includes the regular publication of the detailed budget of the organization, including both income and debits, the membership details, how to publish advertisement to the journal and its cost, and many advertisements, some of which are very interesting, and a list of institutional representatives in different countries. The last category is organizational or managerial details, including a list of the chair bearers of the organization and images like that of Bodh Gaya, the logo of Mahabodhi Society, and others. Next slide. This is the membership details and how it used to be published in the journals. Next slide. This is the list of the country-wise representatives in the left column, whereas in the right you can see the detailed pricing of advertisement publications in the journal, followed by the advertisements that continue to the next page of the journal. After some years, in most of the 20th century issues that we have digitized till now, the advertisement or donation list can no longer be seen anymore. Next slide. So these are the advertisements zoomed out basically. We have categorized these as commercial communication because a journal published and distributed in India by an organization originally from Colombo is publishing the advertisement for tea goods from Burma definitely points toward an intention of collaboration. Next slide. So as I was saying before, the funding source of the journal publication as well as the organization changed after some years. This is an example from the 1908 issue. It reads that the society is being maintained from private sources, but the society also appeals for donations and funds, subscriptions and sellings of Buddhist books. Next slide. This is an example of how the reports on other organizations were used to be published in the journal, especially the Hindu organizations in India. Next slide. This is Anne Besant piece on the headquarters of the Theosophical Society. Next slide. Yeah, the reports and other news from the Chicago Parliament, even the years after the event had already happened, kept being published in the journals. The celebration of the New Year or the decision to organize such another event in Paris in 1999 are some examples. As I discussed earlier, the Parliament was an important gateway for Dharmapala to voice his theological and socio-political concerns and visions to the world, and it gave the missionary a platform to meet and interact with other people with an aligned vision. The 1893 Parliament hosted Pratap Chandra Majumdar as the representative of the Brahmo Samaj. Vivekananda, as we all know, was there representing Hinduism, Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb at the Islam representation, and Anagarika Dharmapala as the representative of the South Asian Buddhism or Theravada. In the journal, I have found Vivekananda's letters and news about Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Pratap Chandra Majumdar. The journal comments much less on Islam, and in my reading holds a hostile approach to it. We will come to that later. Next slide. Now, here are some conversations about the Chicago Parliament from various sources that provide us a background or a context of how the different representatives or agents of different religions perceived the Parliament, or how much that was preached was indeed advocated there. The religious institutions were not in complete agreement throughout the Parliament, and Dharmapala and others had to strongly voice their opinion in resilience. This one reads, the Buddhist reformer Anagarika Dharmapala asked the audience in a large lecture hall, how many of you have read the life of the Buddha? When only 5 raised a hand, he scolded. 5 only? 475 millions of people accept our religion of love and hope. You call yourselves a nation, a great nation, and yet you do not know the history of this great teacher. How dare you judge us? This is where Dharmapala becomes the anti-colonial voice, a polarized political identity who screams in resilience, representing not only Theravada but his countrymen, his fellow natives and other colonized countries loudly at a platform of a world congress. Next slide. Here is another excerpt from a journal article that talks about how one of the prayers at the parliament mentioned Hindus, Mohammedans, and Brahmins as the heathen religions, but it did not get a very positive response. Next slide. This is interesting and relevant to our conversation. This is a letter from Vivekananda to Alasinga Perumal written in 1893 November after the parliament discussing the speakers. Vivekananda comments on Dharmapala as not a good speaker and says that he had only mentioned quotations from Max Muller and Rhys Davids. In the Mohabodi journal that we are currently digitizing, more than half of the articles or letters that are published are by Western personalities, and the name news writings of Massmuller and Davids kept constantly coming up. Here, two readings can be done. Firstly, Dharmapala had to go for the approval of the Western world to effectively gain the approval of the Indians, Sinhalese, and other colonized people. Even in India, he mostly communicated with the elite upper class, upper caste urban Babu in Bengal. He inherited much financially, and Mohabodi also ran with his family funding, as we gather from the earlier journal excerpt. And Kemper also mentioned so in his book on Dharmapala. Thus, it can be inferred that Mohabodi or Dharmapala had no compulsion to work in the villages or with the common people, the marginalized themselves, and the movement remained somewhat constricted to a particular class caste community in India. On the other hand, the second reading could indicate a pro-colonial tendency of Dharmapala's personal political theology and the organizational politics of the Mohabodi society. Placing Dharmapala and the Mohabodi in this matrix of pro-colonial, anti-colonial is an important research question that keeps on rising throughout the readings of the journal. Next slide. Here is an example of how the reports from the Chicago Parliament and action surrounding it was published periodically in the journals. Next slide. A thematic reading of the journal content thus provides certain categories that I have listed here, some of which I have already talked about. There were no women writers who directly contributed to the journal apart from already popular names like Besant. I'm saying from the much I have been able to read till date. There are pieces written on women. For example, Vichad Gandhi sent a letter to publish in the Mohabodi journal that was from his sister Chas Howard to him. The letter talks about her love for India, the importance of establishing more schools and other topics. Other reports mentions the Women Committee in the Chicago Parliament chaired by Miss Elizabeth Boyaton. There are writings on women but not directly by them in the journal. Next slide. Now this is a rare sighting within the volumes, an article regarding Islam. As understood from here, Dharmapala and Mohabodi held a certain hostility towards Islam and Christianity to some extent, unlike their brotherly attitude toward Hinduism. Next, go back to the previous slide. Among the other thematic categories, the one that I want to mention separately in detail is the Bodh Gaya case. Reports about the court hearings have been published in the journal volumes periodically, and if there has been no court event before the publication of any particular journal issue, verbatim has been at least mentioned. Next slide. Digitizing and working with Mohabodi archive is important for the materials are in very bad conditions. Alekho will discuss more broadly regarding the digitization process, what we have experienced and not. But it is also extremely important because they are able to reflect on the missing puzzle pieces of plural voices from the 19th and 20th century history. Moreover, the work is very relevant today in contemporary times where the politics of religious extremism flourishes, implementing the politics of erasure. Dharmapala was able to reach out globally. Mohabodi was not a minor movement from its very beginning, but they were minorized, and today they do not reside permanently in the public memory, if not at all. Dharmapala and Mohabodi movement, the organization, have been casted away at the peripheries of the global intellectual histories. It is high time to explore such an archive. Thank you.
Maitrayee Mukherjee, Project Fellow, the EAP project. during the digitization of the Mahabharata society journal.